Hello and welcome back. The chase continues for Alex Ovechkin. At the time of recording, he is 12 goals away, and in this video, we'll look at my model's predictions for when he'll break that record and look at guys that you can get off the waiver wire to get exposure to Ovi, which will come in handy this week as the Caps have a great schedule in Week 20 as well. So let's do what we always do and start with the schedule breakdown for Week 20. 54 games this week, spread out very evenly. You've got Monday with 6, Wednesday with 5, Friday with 6, Sunday with 8. There are 13 teams that play 4 games. They're all over here. You can see them here, and they're all down here at the bottom if they're not listed here. Washington has the best schedule. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday. It would be a perfect schedule if all of those were light nights. Minimal travel. They've got 3 home games, some winnable opponents. They've got a sub 500 Seattle team coming in. They've got a banged up Rangers team that they're going to play on the road. They do have a couple of more difficult games with teams looking for playoff pushes here, but the Caps have been a machine all season long. They just lost 2 games in a row for the first time in months, but they are still a wagon, and they're obviously looking for that Ovechkin chase. We'll get into that in the next slide. You also have Anaheim here. They've got a back-to-back on the road Tuesday, Wednesday, but they play Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, so a nice setup towards the back half of the week. We got Chicago here, maybe not the best team to pick from. They have some guys that might be available at the deadline. We'll have to look at that as well. They play Monday, Wednesday, Friday. LA with a much nicer schedule. Chicago, St. Louis twice, and then they do have this Sunday game, which is a little bit harder against Vegas. The Rangers are coming into this week on a back-to-back. So Sunday they play, and this is the second night of a back-to-back, and it's a 4-point game that they desperately need. They need this one bad too. These 2 games at the back end of the week are going to be must-wins, and they just got a little bit worse, trading Ryan Lindgren to the Colorado Avalanche as I was recording this video. So that is a little bit of a bombshell in terms of Rangers land, but nothing crazy. He was a UFA, was kind of expected, but that does make them slightly worse defensively, and they really couldn't afford that with Adam Fox out. So we'll get into some of their ads going forward. We also have the Islanders here. I'm mentioning them because they're going to have to use a backup goaltender twice. It could be Jakub Skarek, who did see some time against the Rangers last week. It could be Högberg, who's played really well when called upon. We'll get into that in the goaltending section. The rest of these teams have a little bit of a heavier schedule or are maybe not the most desirable teams, but we will look at all the players from these teams in the Player Hub in a couple of slides. But before we do that, I want to take a quick look at a little bit of a longer term time frame. The next 2 weeks, if you're looking to get into your playoffs, the next 2 weeks are crucial if they start week 22. You need a lot of game volume. You can get that from the Rangers and the Ducks. So we will cover them a little bit more in detail. They have a little bit more light night games than what's being shown because obviously these aren't classified as light night with 6 games on Monday, Friday, and then 8 on Sunday, but they do have some light night games in there, and they do have the most games over the next 2 weeks. Worth mentioning that Calgary only plays 5 games over the next 2 weeks. So if you have Huberdeau, Kadri, maybe Mackenzie Weegar, definitely look at some waiver ads going forward. With all of that said, we're going to take a quick turn here to the best schedule this week, and that is the Washington Capitals. This is their animated graph. It's pretty much what you would expect. Ovechkin breaking out at the beginning of the year. He kind of stays exactly there because he was injured. And then you have this pocket of players here who are ownable, and you can find some value on the waiver wire. We will get into some of those options going forward, but obviously Ovechkin is the talk of the town right now, chasing Wayne Gretzky, and I put together this stuff before the game today. He obviously was playing today, but this is the Ovechkin record prediction. So he's got 12 goals to surpass Gretzky's 894. He's got 883 right now. I have a machine learning algorithm that is predicting 15 goals over the remaining 23 games, and with that pace, that 0.66 goal per game pace, he's got a pretty decent probability of doing it sometime in early April. I would like to see it at home, so that would put this April 4th game against Chicago as what I would hope would happen in terms of, the best thing for the league. But he does have around a 7 to 8% chance of breaking it for any of these early April games. So this is what we've got our eye on. Let's hope it's this game against Chicago or this game against Carolina at home, or maybe this Columbus game. But if he doesn't get it there, it will be on the road somewhere. They've got 2 opportunities to do it on Long Island. And then there's some other interdivisional games here, Columbus, Pittsburgh. So these are potential options for when he's going to break that record, but you're going to want to have exposure to Ovechkin because they're going to try to feed him at every turn. So let's take a look at the Player Hub and take a look at some options you can find off the waiver wire. As we turn to the Player Hub, I want to quickly mention that I've added roster percentages and line combinations to the Player Hub. You can look at it in the data table view over here. You can also filter by ownership percentage, which is a game changer for me. This is going to help a lot, especially right before playoffs when you're looking for those ads based on how ownable they are in your league. So you can access this via the Patreon link in the description below. As we look at Ovechkin, over a point per game for a 39-year-old is crazy. 0.7 goals per game average on the season is also crazy. 30 goals in 43 games. He's predicted to put up a 0.66 goal per game pace via that model I showed earlier. So with that, he could potentially break at least 35 goals, if not 40 this year. Definitely needs 42 to break the record. So he has that in him with this goal scoring pace. The shot volume is excellent, almost 4 shots per game, still getting his power play points. The crazy thing for me, almost 2 hits per game for a guy who's that old is pretty incredible. So you're going to want exposure to him because everybody's going to be trying to find him for that record-breaking goal. The best option for that would be Pierre-Luc Dubois. He's more than likely their best defensive center. He's line 2, power play 1. They might throw him out there at the end of the game to take those draws when the net is empty. So that would be a huge reason to own him. He's already 94th percentile in assists. That's another reason to own him. So this could be an option for you. He's 53% owned. If you can't get him, Alexei Protas might be your best option, 48% owned. Line 1, penalty kill 2, doesn't get power play time. So it's crazy that he's 94th percentile in goals and he's only got 1 power play point. So everything is done 5-on-5 for Protas. 50 points in 59 games is really amazing. The only detriment to his file, 21.1% shooting percentage is high. That's because he doesn't shoot a lot, 1.85 shots per game. 4 points in his last 5, so he's getting it done recently. So he might be another one of your best ads this week in terms of getting exposure to Ovechkin. You could potentially also look at Connor McMichael. He's 48% owned, similar to Protas. Of the two, I would rather have Protas, but McMichael could get you some decent exposure, line 2 and power play 2. So Protas isn't getting you any power play exposure, whereas McMichael will, and Ovechkin plays on both units. So maybe that's a little bit better of an option. 10 power play points for McMichael on the year. His shot volume is also a little bit better at 2.19. Now, if you're looking for a defensive ad, there's a couple we'll get to later in the video in terms of all of the teams with the 12-game schedule or with the 4-game schedules. But I did want to mention, obviously, Carlson and Chychrun are owned up. Sandin and Roy are very identical here. Roy is maybe your best hits and blocks option from the Caps with this schedule set up. 90th percentile in blocks, 80th in hits, 1.9 hits per game. Everything else is relatively low, but he does get some assists. Both of these guys have 17 assists on the year, 21 points for Sandin, 19 for Matt Roy. This has been a huge factor in them turning around their defense. So these two guys have really solidified everything along with Chychrun. Sandin, a little bit more of an offensive option in most cases. He has 3 power play points, so he does get occasional power play time. A little bit lower in terms of hits, but still a decent hits and blocks option. He's 9% owned. So there's a couple of options for you in terms of defensive ads. You also have McElrath for hits at 2.09 if he gets in the lineup. Faravari, another hits and blocks option at 1.88 hits, 1.97 blocks. Of those guys, I would probably prefer Roy for his deployment. With all of that said, let's take a quick look at the teams that have the 8 games over the next 2 weeks, and that includes Anaheim. They have a 4-game week this week, so let's take a look at them. And there are a number of guys you can find off the waiver wire. We'll clear this positional filter so you can find everybody. They have a number of guys. The highest owned guy is Frank Vetrano. He's really complete at a 79 completeness rating, 66% owned. Definitely a shot volume guy at 3.19 shots per game. He might be owned up. So if he is, your best ad is probably Troy Terry. Terry is going to get you line 1 assignment exposure and power play 1 exposure. 22% owned is really reasonable for a guy with really good stats. 92nd percentile in point per game, 93rd in assists, and nothing short of 85th percentile in any offensive metric. Doesn't hit or block at all, but that's not really what you're owning him for. He's kind of more of a points league play in that regard, that he's not going to give you that peripheral floor that you would want in a categories league, but this is a guy that would get you that nice exposure. He is playing relatively well. 6 points in his last 5 games is a nice stretch of hockey for Troy Terry. You could also go Ryan Strome, who's also going to get you line 1 and power play 1 exposure, but at 4% ownership. Obviously, his metrics are lower than a guy like Terry. Assists are pretty good. That's what he's been known for a while now. They are potentially making a playoff push. They're getting, playing a little bit better recently. And with that, they might rely on their veterans a little bit more. So you could get out in front of that for the next 2 weeks and pick up a guy like Ryan Strome. Zegras was playing pretty well until he went and did whatever the hell he was trying to do with that hit. Got a 3-game suspension. Nothing crazy in his file, but he was starting to play a little bit better. 0.47 point per game, 2.06 shots per game. So obviously his main feature is his shootout prowess, but that's not going to help you in fantasy. In terms of defense, I do want to mention a couple of guys here because they do have some excellent hits and blocks options, which we know about. We've seen them before. You have Radko Gudas, 3.47 hits per game, 2.32 blocks per game, 98th, 99th percentile respectively. He's your best hits and blocks option. He's at 36% rostered. You also have Trouba, who's almost identical, 37% rostered, 86th in hits, 100th in blocks. So both of these guys are going to get you excellent hits and blocks volume for the next 2 weeks as they have 8 games over that stretch. I would definitely go out and grab one of these guys if you're in a categories league and you need those categories. But I also want to mention Jackson Lacombe, who is, he does occasionally get power play 1 time. Right now, I think he's currently listed power play 2 or not listed at all here in the data. But with that, 74, almost a 75 on the completeness rating, 5 power play points, 29 points in 51 games, 10 goals on the year is the best you're going to find in terms of an ownable fantasy defenseman. So really good goal numbers for a D, 92nd percentile in terms of blocks, and he does get power play 1 time, 5 points in his last 5 games. He's red hot coming into this stretch of 8 games over the next 2 weeks. So did want to mention him, and he's been a guy that was picked up in my league. He's been picked up in the Creators League as well. So people are starting to key in on the fact that he is a really fantasy ownable defenseman. Now, the other team that plays the 8 games over that stretch is the New York Rangers. There's nowhere near as many options available on the waiver wire because obviously their top guys are owned up. Panarin, Fox, Miller, Zibanejad, Trocheck. Lafreniere is the next guy on this list, but he has not been great. Doesn't get a lot of power play time. 32 points in 59 is disappointing for a 57% owned player. Your best ad is definitely going to be Will Cooley. He is a hitting machine. I've owned him for that purpose in my category league for a long time. 3.75 hits per game, 99th percentile. But right now he's playing line 2 with Mika Zibanejad, and he's getting power play 2 exposure. Picked up a goal last night, assisted by Zibanejad. And that's especially the case with Chris Kreider in and out of the lineup. So if Kreider's not in, they're going to have Cooley on that second line. That's going to benefit you if you go out and grab him. A goal scorer right now, 16 goals in 59 games. This is pretty much your Tom Wilson prototype, just a little bit less prolific as he's only in his 2nd year, but he's your best bet this week for a potential ad, mainly because of his hits. You could take a look at Keandre Miller, who's going to get elevated ice time. Nothing crazy in his file, but he is defensive pairing 1, power play 2, 86th percentile in terms of blocks, 1.51 hits is not bad either. He's only got 1 point in his last 5 games, though. Braden Schneider will also see an increased role. He's D3. That'll increase to D2 as they upgrade these line assignments. 94th percentile in terms of blocks, 78th in terms of hits. So there are a couple of options here, but none are crazy available in terms of their top guys, the power play guys. Lafreniere is getting a little power play time, but I still wouldn't want to own him just given his production. And he's really, eye test looked really bad this year compared to last year. So that's going to do it for our look at the teams, but let's take a look at the Player Hub pre-filtered to all of the teams with 4-game weeks. In addition to filtering the teams, I also filtered ownership percentage down to 69% or lower. So this will give us a good sense, depending on your league size, of who you can potentially afford on the waiver wire. Granlund is your highest point total ad this week, 77 on the completeness rating. He is 68% owned, but if he's available, he's 3-position eligible. He's line 2 and power play 2 right now. Not going to get you that elite power play 1 exposure that he was getting in San Jose, where he racked up those 15 power play points, but he is still playing pretty well. As I click on his name, we'll see his last 2-week stats. They're not that bad. 4 points in his last 5, all assists, but still relatively good for a guy coming over. He played really well at the Four Nations as well, so he's kind of feeling it lately. We mentioned Protas and Dubois. Troy Terry, we also mentioned. Connor McMichael's another option for you, but I do want to touch on Matvei Michkov. He is absolutely on fire. I believe he's got 10 points in his last 5, but 8 points in his last 4, 3 goals, 5 assists, line 3, but power play 1 exposure. That's the main thing here. Really good in terms of all of his offensive metrics, no lower than an 86th percentile in any of these, 91st on the power play, 15 power play points on the year, 44 points in 58 games, and it's going to be between him, Celebrini, and potentially Lane Hudson for the Calder Trophy. All three have been excellent. Celebrini is a guy is lower on this list. We'll talk about in just a second, but Matvei Michkov is red hot entering into this 4-game week, 45% owned. He's definitely a must own in fantasy if he's available on your waiver wire. As we look at some of the hot trending players here, Ryan Donato is another guy, 3-position eligible. He's been relatively hot, 4 points in his last 5. He's line 1 and power play 1, so getting you exposure to Connor Bedard. At 24% ownership, he's definitely more available than Michkov. He's just not quite as hot. He could be on the move. He's been on the trade block. I just don't know whether or not they'll do that. He's having a career season playing with Connor Bedard, so I would potentially, if I were them, like to keep him. 10 power play points, 40 points on the year. Hits, 1.65 hits per game is pretty decent, 74th percentile there. So a decent peripheral floor, excellent line assignment exposure, 24% owned there. You also could find Teravainen on the waiver wire. He's also power play 1 at 15% rostered. He's going to be a little bit more ownable. However, his file is a little bit less dynamic. 94th percentile in power play is great. You're getting power play assists from him. 19 power play points on the season, 43 points on the year. Lot lower shot volume, no hits, no peripherals there. So that's why his ownership is a bit lower. As we continue with this, Quentin Byfield had that 4-assist game last week. I mentioned him on the video last week. With that, 5 points in his last 5. Line 1, power play 2. So not the best power play exposure, but he is going to get line 1 exposure, and he's 3-position eligible. That 47% ownership is a little bit high, but with that, he's getting you a lot of roster flexibility and a 4-game week this week, so that's worth noting. The Isles with another game, another 4-game week. Brock Nelson may not be a part of their team, though. He is on the trade block. I would expect him to get moved. You could get out in front of that now. Line 2, power play 2, really good shot volume here, 2.69 shots per game. 54% owned is a little bit high, so he may not be available for you there. There are a couple of other options. I do want to touch on Warren Fogle, who's a third liner with really excellent goal coverage. So 2.4 shots per game is nice. 86th percentile in terms of goals, 17 goals on the year, no power play points. So all 5-on-5, but decent shot volume. He's 15% rostered, 5 points in his last 5 games, 3 goals, 2 assists. So for a guy at 15%, you could do a lot worse than Fogle, who had a really nice week last week. As we unfilter and look at a couple more options, you have JJ Peterka here, 38% owned. He's potentially on the move as well. I've seen his name out there. 38% rostered, no lower than 84th percentile in the offensive metrics is really nice. 2.2 shots per game, 90th percentile in assists, 91st in point per game. He's a really reliable, usually higher shot volume than this kind of player, but his ideal shooting range, 13.9% shooting, 3 points in his last 4. So he's pretty decent heading into a 4-game week. His teammate, Jason Zucker, is a little bit more of a power play option, 93rd percentile there, which is a little bit surprising. I would have, if I didn't know this, I would have looked at Peterka more as the power play guy, but lower shot volume, higher power play numbers. Everything else is pretty consistent. 18 goals to 17, 26, 27 assists, basically the exact same point total, just a little bit more power play coverage, a little bit lower shot volume for Zucker. As we look at a couple other options, I talked about Celebrini. He's a must own. If for whatever reason he's on your waiver wire, 61% ownership, he's definitely a must own. He's going to get you obviously power play 1 exposure if this pops for him, but 3.4 shots per game is incredible for a young player, 98th percentile. That's what you would expect from Connor Bedard, and yet Celebrini is doing that consistently this year. 93rd in power play, 93rd in goals, 18 goals, 24 assists, 42 points, 14 power play points, just everything that you would want to see. Line 1, power play 1. So if he's available on your wire, go out and grab Celebrini. There's a couple of other names we could cover. I'll just give you a quick glimpse. A little bit further down the roster, you could get Palmieri at 15%. You could get maybe even Chandler Stevenson for some power play points, 17 power play points for Stevenson at 11% ownership. There's a couple of other guys. Jaden Schwartz could get you line 1, power play 1 exposure. Same thing with Capo Caco if he's available. Maybe not the best in terms of your fantasy ads this week, but in a deeper league, he would be a guy you could look at. 89th percentile in shot volume, 88th in goals. And then there's a couple of other options as we filter down a little bit. Owen Tippett obviously is a must-own as well, even though he's a little bit further down this list. We mentioned a couple of these other guys, so I'm not going to go too deep down this list. You can access this list in the Patreon link in the description below and play with this yourself to find exactly what you need. You can also work with these filters, which we will do coming up. As I look at the D, we can find some of your best hits and blocks options by looking at the hits percentile filter, and we'll try to find some of the better options for you. The best obviously being Gudis at 3.47, 2.32 blocks. Same thing with Trouba. You can also find a couple of other reasonable options. Romanov at 2.27 hits per game, 2.59 blocks per game. Excellent option there. 2 goals in his last 4 games. 2 of those 4 goals on the season coming in the last 4 games. So a nice little bump in his offensive production. They've been banged up with some injuries, so he's been benefiting from that ice time as well. You could also go with Eric Chernak, who I haven't touched on yet, but another reasonable hits and blocks option. A little bit more hits heavy, which could benefit you depending on the league you're in. 88th percentile, 2.25 hits per game, 83rd percentile blocks, 4 points in his last 5 games. He is D2. I believe he's a penalty killer, not necessarily a power play guy, but he is going to get you some exposure to those top 6 forwards in Tampa Bay that you're going to want exposure to. So at 8%, you could do a lot worse in terms of a hits and blocks option with some offensive upside than a guy like Chernak. There are a couple of other options for you. You can look through the list and pick out whatever might be more important to you. Connor Murphy is a potential ad if you're looking for blocks. There are some other options in terms of power play points as we scroll a little bit further down. Most of these guys are 0, but you do have Riker Evans, who did get a little bit of power play time earlier in the year. But that's going to do it for the D. Let's take a quick pivot now and take a look at some goaltending options as we head into week 20. On the Goalie Hub, I also added the roster percentages here. They're available in this table here, and you can filter by that as well, which is what we're doing now. 69% or lower. That's going to give us some guys that we can find on the waiver wire. Your best bet in terms of this chart, ordered by the ranking that I give these goaltenders, is Vejmelka, but they're on a 2-game week this week. He's been playing excellent. He was playing excellent for most of the year, just could not get the wins. He has been getting them lately. 4 wins in his last 5, 2.2 goals against, 911 save percentage. Obviously, the thing that was hurting this entire team was the fact that they had Durzi and John Marino that were out earlier in the season for months on end. They've got both of them back. They're healthy. They're making a playoff push. They're playing really well right now. So this is definitely somebody you would want exposure to normally. He's well above expected. 910 save percentage, 2.5 goals against. Team defense is pretty decent at 48%. So this would be a guy I would like for a longer term hold, but not necessarily a good ad this week. Same type of thing with Kevin Lankinen. I did pick him up. He's been really excellent lately. 2 wins in his last 3, 939 save percentage, 1.67 goals against. And now with Demko potentially out, I don't know how long that's going to be. He's the number 1 guy in Vancouver. They have a 3-game week this week, so maybe not the most games that you're going to find, but he is the starter, so he's going to get you at least 2, if not 3 games this week. In terms of backups, you have Casey DeSmith. They have a back-to-back this week. 9% owned. He's 917 in his last 2 starts with 2 wins, 2.5 goals against, so still playing really well. 913 save percentage on the year, well above expected. Team defense is great. Everything you like to see. Dallas is a really excellent team, and they've only improved since adding a couple of pieces with Granlund and Ceci. You can also go out and grab Spencer Knight. He's been excellent in a backup role. 1 win in his last game, 944 save percentage in that one, 907 on the year, 2.4 goals against. He's above expected, and the team defense is great there as well. In terms of what we were talking about with the Anaheim Ducks with their 8 games over the next 2 weeks, you can potentially find Dostal and Gibson both on this list. Dostal way above expected, 98th percentile there. The team defense is atrocious, but with that, he's a 910 save percentage, so that's excellent. 17 wins. He's got higher win count than a guy like Gibson, so maybe he gets a little bit more of the start volume. 3 wins in his last 5, 921 save percentage, 2.4 goals against, so he's been getting it done recently. He would be your better ad of the 2. John Gibson at 15% is still potentially ownable. He played the last game, didn't get the win, but a 950 save percentage is really nice. 915 on the year is great. He's also way above expected. he could be on the move depending on what Anaheim wants to do at the deadline. His preferred destinations are apparently Carolina and Edmonton. Edmonton could use a guy like this. Skinner has not been all that great. They've been giving up a ton of goals since the Four Nations ended, so maybe they go out and get a guy like Gibson, and you can get out in front of that at 15% right now. Even if they don't trade him, you're going to get a ton of volume from these two guys over the next 2 weeks, so definitely worth mentioning here. Looking at a couple of other options, Charlie Lindgren, excellent team exposure, but he just hasn't been that great. .837 save percentage in the last 2 starts, .896 on the year, and a little bit below 50% win percentage. So that's not great for a guy who's playing in front of or playing behind a really excellent team that's atop the Eastern Conference. So I would expect a little bit better. Obviously, it's Thompson's net, but at 32% to get a guy who's going to get you good team exposure, it's always worth a flyer for a guy like that. Same type of thing with Freddie Anderson. His ownership is way higher. 6 wins in 10 is a lot better than a guy like Lindgren in terms of win percentage. Team defense is better as well. He is above expected, .903 on the year. 2.3 goals against is nice there, but his last start was atrocious. .778 save percentage, not great there. Now, as we look at the Islanders goaltenders that I was mentioning earlier, Magnus Hoberg is the best option. .947 on the year, 1.5 goals against, but only 2 wins in 7 games. That's kind of crazy, given the fact that he is way above expected, 8.4 above expected. He's played really well when needed, but for whatever reason just hasn't gotten the wins. And that could potentially be because of their offense. They don't necessarily have the best offense. I would love to see Varlamov come back. He doesn't necessarily have the best profile this year. He's been hurt for quite a while. I would love to see him come back and relieve Sorokin, because I own Sorokin, and he's been faltering lately. The last 4 starts have been terrible for him, mainly because he's playing every single game. So I would love to see them give him a rest. Hoberg would be the best option if available. But last game they had Skarek in. He doesn't even have a file because he wasn't there to start the year. But he did come in relief in the game against the Rangers and played pretty well in that game when it was already pretty much out of hand. But of those guys, I would definitely prefer to have Hoberg. If he's going to get 2 starts, that would definitely be advantageous. At 2% rostered, you could do a lot worse than that. You can probably find him anywhere on the waiver wire. That's going to do it for this video. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching. I appreciate that. This is the dog days of the YouTube season. I'm not getting a ton of views, so any support is greatly appreciated. If you want access to the Goaltending Hub or the updated Player Hub, you can get that in the Patreon link in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.